Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast, and I'm talking today with Kedric Kwan again. Kedric, you're becoming quite the regular here. I guess that's what happens. You know, we have good conversations about interesting topics, or at least they're interesting to me. Tend to have several of them. But kind of what brought us together today, some conversation we were having. We're at IPF Worlds in Malta, talking about coaching and training. Lots of things in the area. We were talking about app-based training and predictive models and top-down versus bottom-up training and all that. And you said something I thought was really interesting and probably a good jumping off point, a training and coaching conversation. You said that the more you do coaching, the more you see coaching as economics and the less you see it as physics. Hopefully I quoted you correctly, or at least approximately. But maybe that's a good place for us to kind of begin today's conversation. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me back again, and obviously secondly, thank you for entertaining my ruminations. So it's always fun to be able to bounce what some people may see as esoteric with someone else. So thank you for being a conversation partner. And yeah, I think that I think you quoted me perfectly, right? I think that the more I coach, the more I realize that the element of coaching, whether that's nutrition, whether that's training, is more economics rather than physics. So what I mean by that is just the components equates into like certain prediction models, right? So generally, when you look at physics, it's quite hard. Right? I don't want to say it's like objective, even though it is, because then I don't want to draw saying that economics is not objective. It is a social science. But like I said, if you combine X amount of electrons with protons, or clearly I'm not that great in physics, so all the physicists out there might be cringing right now. But you can predict what the outcome would be, right? So if you and you can say like, a carbon has X amount of weight, and humans are made out of X amount of carbons, things like this. So in a way, the prediction claims you can make is really, really strong. The big factors that we have to factor out, like quantum physics or quantum indeterminacy, right? Where we basically say, we don't really know. We can't observe we can't measure what we observe and all that kind of stuff. So let's just factor that out. But let's just talk about like most physics in high school, which is probably where my physics proficiency is, right? But then when we have economics, in a way, there are also different school of thoughts in economics. So like I said, the economists out there don't come hunting after me. Essentially, we look at certain like laws, right? Things like at least how I perceive economics is that human action, right, or human nature kind of like plays a big role into it, right? You have certain laws, sort of supply and demand, right? Incentives, right? Humans respond to incentives or certain trade-offs, right? Opportunity cost, which is a term that is used in economics. It basically just means what are the trade-offs. And I think that coaching is more like that, because you have like this like certain laws, like, okay, cool, progressive overload, you need some form of progressive overload across a period of time, right? And then how the athlete or the lifter responds to that is very different. Things like specificity. We in our previous podcast we talk about specificity. Something if listeners haven't listened to that, I highly recommend that conversation as well. Like, the laws of specificity is there, but then how the lifter responds to that law would be very, very different. And at the end of the day, the role of the coach is to kind of look at, with those certain laws in place, right? Because we kind of like need some form of, I would say, theoretical, lay out some theoretical groundwork, and we evaluate how the lifter responds. And then it's about managing trade-offs. Like if I do X exercise, we often think about, okay, cool, if I do X exercise, I get this benefit, right? If I do overhead tricep extension, right, I train the long head of the tricep, I train all three heads of the tricep in a better position, right? I get this benefit. But I don't think that we don't usually look at it from the perspective that, okay, if I do this exercise, what benefit would I not get from doing something else? Because there's always that trade-off that we have to manage. But I think that it's the same, because when it comes to coaching, because at the end of the day, like, it ties into the conversation about specificity that we had. The more specific you're doing something, right, you get this huge benefit of potentially practicing the competition movement, but you also have this trade-off elsewhere, right? And it's all about managing that trade-off. So that is why, conceptually, I think that coaching/training is more economics rather than physics, primarily because the human action and that response would be very, very different from each individual, despite the same like foundation being laid and those foundations would be like this, the general principles of strength training, I would say.
I mean, it makes sense on the level that I'm at as well, that on one, you get a lot of complexity in human behavior. You get people are bringing emotional baggage with them, I mean, it doesn't have to be like a deep trauma or something like that. Like it's at least to me, to my ear, it can sound a bit melodramatic to frame it that way, but where it actually makes contact with reality, I think most often in a coaching scenario is athletes have their own perceptions of what we're doing in addition to what's actually happening. And the closer attention I pay to things like training effect, the more I see the athlete's expectation having a major role to play in what's going on. Time to peak has become my favorite example of this. It does seem to be an observed phenomenon that I've seen, that athletes tend to have a consistent time to peak when we, program in certain ways that, have become commonplace for how we do things at RTS. So time to peak becomes this consistent thing. But then when you look a little, when you try to figure out like, what is it that is affecting this time to peak? And, we know that it seems to be more linked to number of exposures. Time to peak may not be the best phrasing. It's like number of exposures to a peak condition. So what counts as an exposure? Well, that seems to depend on how the athlete perceives the exposure. Does a touch and go bench press count as an exposure? Well, for some athletes, it seems like it does. And then other athletes, it seems like it doesn't. And the delineating factor there is the athlete's perception, which feels it's not as concrete as I wish it was, and I'm sure the same is true for a lot of people listening to this. Like, it would be nice to have, concrete answers, like you're building a car engine and you've got to tune it just so, and you've got to get the internal pressure just right and all these things. And then at the end, you've got a car engine. It's a predictable result. That's not what we're dealing with when it comes to coaching. It's not inputs and outputs quite that way. It's a dynamic system that's always responding, and you look for the predictable factor, and there are some. In fact, there's could be quite a lot if you're paying close enough attention. It's just not ever going to be at the level of like building an engine. In fact, it's got a lot more similarity with cultivating a garden. I think if my daughter just planted a bunch of beans at her day. And so if we're growing beans and we're like, well, how much water do I put on the beans? Well, I mean, you can generalize it, but the exact amount is going to depend on the conditions, and it's going to depend on the beans, So is it with training volume, well, what's the amount of training volume that so-and-so needs? Like, well, it'll depend on their conditions. It'll depend on their injury history. It'll depend on how well trained they are and the recovery factors and all those things that coaches are paid to pay attention to, right? I definitely like the analogy of coaching is more like gardening than it is like being a mechanic.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's interesting as well because what you're saying when I hear you sort of like describe time to peak is what is time to peak reduced to, right? So like in philosophy, there's this concept called like reducibility. So if you have something, then what does it reduce to? What's the bottom layer? And you mentioned that it's kind of like that subjective experience, which is kind of like an answer people don't want, because I'm not trying to say that, oh, cool, this everything in this world is purely subjective. There's no everything is just how you feel, right? And not, but what you're describing is that how the lifter or the athlete perceives what is being recommended actually plays a very important role. And it does seem like that is kind of like your ability to kind of like create the exposure. So it's not just simply posing the lifter to some specific stimulus, but it's kind of like setting the background, whether that's through reps, sets, intensity, but also through your expectation from that session, right? Like if you go in, like I'm not sure if you go in and you tell this lifter, okay, cool, if I do a single, right? So theoretically you do a single at RP 7, right? And you just only do that single and nothing else. And you tell lifter A, okay, cool, this single will be enough to give you some stimulation without too much fatigue. And therefore you can make progress. Perhaps that lifter would have an expectation that, okay, cool, this is perhaps an exposure, right? The lifter B, perhaps you can just say, oh, you don't tell that lifter anything, and let's grant that the lifter think that this like single is nothing because this lifter is not working hard enough. So I'm not sure whether lifter B would consider that as an exposure, and then would that, in based on what obviously you understand the time to peak phenomena better, right? Would you think lifter A and lifter B would have the same time to peak if they go to an entire training block every week doing, let's just say they have week to week you do that single at 7 and nothing, right? And then let's say you have already 3 weeks, so you have technically lifter A has 3 exposures more than lifter B, just solely from the lifter's perception. Do you think the time to peak would be the same for lifter A and lifter B?
No, I don't think it would be the same, but I'm not sure how it would be different. There is something that seems at least somewhat concrete when it comes to time to peak. To give you an example of this, like I mentioned, it seems to be tied to exposures more than time. So in the event that we do a 2x microcycle frequency, meaning that you have exposures that repeat more rapidly, you do 2 microcycles in a week instead of 1. The volume is adjusted so that it's roughly half the amount of volume per microcycle. So you're still getting your recovery from training load is time-based. That's a kind of a cellular metabolism thing. At least on some levels, it seems to be. So there is a time component to that. So you do have to adjust volumes, but in terms of your exposure to a movement, exposure to a stimulus, you increase the frequency and you will get a faster peak in terms of time. So maybe an example would be helpful. Let's say that my time to peak is 6 exposures. If I do 1 microcycle per week, then 6 exposures will be 6 weeks. Now, if I did 2 microcycles per week, 6 exposures will be in roughly 3 weeks. It has to do with how many microcycles are you exposing to rather than how long do those microcycles take. So when we've how to say this? So when I've had a few lifters who train on a 1x microcycle frequency, and we establish their time to peak that way, and then I'll move them to a 2x microcycle frequency without a whole lot of communication about it. Maybe they've heard me talk about it elsewhere and thus have some kind of expectation. It doesn't seem super likely, though. They don't seem to be that kind of person, generally speaking. You do see, time to peak shorten as you would predict. So even without like setting the expectation for them, there does seem to be some kind of adjustment. It's relating a phenomenon that's there. It's not merely placebo. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So that like, it's funny because like I said, it's when we mentioned we don't really know what that answer is, right? Sometimes there's that subjective element of how a lift perceive it. And I think that I often have this thought is just that when it comes to how a lifter responds, right? And when it comes to nutrition as well, I tell certain lifters that I coach, I said that, there are merits to figuring exactly why something works. But if something works and we can't figure it out, right, from a purely pragmatic and practical point of view, we don't necessarily need to figure it out, right? Especially if we can kind of somewhat replicate what we're doing, right? For in this case, we're using exposure, right, as a surrogate for whatever that is happening, and as long as we can kind of replicate that to a certain extent, we don't necessarily need to find out down to like the subatomic particles what is the reason why this is happening. So I think that maybe from like an intellectual exercise, just trying to figure things out is useful, but from a practical point of view, it isn't necessarily always the case. I mean that is when it comes to nutrition as well. Like when I look at when you go deep down to the molecular level about like muscle protein synthesis, mTOR activation, right? When you tell the lifters anything that's related to that, unless they are someone who is like a huge massive exercise science nerd, they'll probably just be like, I don't need to know this. Just tell me how much protein to eat in one meal, right? And then I just say, cool, this is what you do, right? So I think that for training, it's kind of the same, right? Where you don't necessarily need to figure out down to the exact cause. And then I feel like a strong correlation is good enough sometimes when it comes to training, at least when it comes to practice, because when you deal with a large sample size, perhaps you need some form of causation, right? Because you want to make sure that everybody, you'll be able to repeat that across the entire group. Coaching, or at least individualized coaching, by definition, you're not recommending things in you're not just using like large strokes and making everybody do the same thing. You're by definition individualizing things. Hence, you don't necessarily need to have that causation, right? Because you don't need to replicate that causation in lifter A, in lifter B, because lifter A and lifter B, they're just vastly different, training age, history, and all the other factors that might be different from lifter A and lifter B. So I think that the emphasis on causation is kind of like is dampened, also potentially due to a lack of like the link, right? There's not a clear link on why these two person are the same. In fact, like I think that most human response, while we can categorize them as like, okay, cool, we have this like I said, those general principles of strength training, we do respond to a certain extent in some predictive manner over time. If you progressively overload, you probably get stronger, put on some muscle across a long period of time. But what is a long period of time for lifter A would be very different from a long period of time for lifter B, and I think that is something that people, I don't know whether people don't like to hear, but sometimes you just have to admit that there's some things that I really don't know, and I cannot give you a clear cut answer. Maybe it makes people feel uncomfortable saying that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I had a client once upon a time who I prescribed a movement for them, close grip bench. It wasn't anything too far out there, and they asked me, why did I put that exercise in their program versus any of the other possible exercises? And I thought about it, and the truest answer that I could say is that when we do this, your bench gets better. That this is an established pattern that we've observed. But that's also unsatisfying, and came to interpret the question a little bit differently. I came to kind of read that question as, give me a reason to believe in the thing that you put down here. And the observed relationship is the truest reason, and fundamentally the reason why I picked that movement. That was also not the most helpful thing that I could say from a coaching standpoint. Even if it was more conjecture, even if it was frankly less true, coming up with some sort of narrative about why I chose that movement provided more athlete buy-in, and I mean, coaches talk about buy-in all the time, right? Saying something along the lines of, this providing a better range of motion for, pectoral development, or, something about shifting emphasis to try anything, like as long as it was plausible and fit into the framework of how he understood his training up to that point, it would be helpful. And, you could layer on, like, it doesn't have to be just one reason, right? Like, you could layer on the other reason as well. Like, the main thing is that I see it be more effective in your training data. And I suspect that the reasons why are X, Y, and Z. So like, you can say it without, I'm not saying to make things up. You can be honest about it and be honest in your uncertainty, but communicate the theory a little bit. I found that's fairly helpful. I kind of thought it was a little surprising. You mentioned kind of about details, and I would have, maybe this is just like the subset of lifters that I tend to work. I would have thought that really getting into the weeds on mTOR and things like that would be helpful. Not necessarily that it makes your prescriptions nutritionally any better, but just that it's helpful for motivating athletes to actually adhere to the thing that you're trying to get them to do.
Yeah, I think that it is the questions that are like for me, I generate this model of a lifter in my head when based on the questions the lifter would ask, right? Like I think I just have the tendency to kind of like being unrestrained, just ramble, which some of the listeners might be unfortunately succumb to in this podcast episode. But so I would probably just say that I try to form this model of this lifter in my head, right? I'm not saying that's going to be accurate based on the questions they asked, and then provide the answers accordingly. Some people that I coach just like to spar with me intellectually, and almost to the point where they're just paying me to essentially become a debate partner, because they literally do not follow anything I recommend, and they just find reasons to disagree, right, and try to push back. So there are people like that, right? So those people I would mentor them to the death, right? But there are some that would be just like, I have a whole bunch of things that I need to do, right? I just want to know what I need to do, just tell me and I will execute, right? And then there are those like that as well, right? And more often than not, those people are very different. The lifter B who just wants to know what to do usually have life outside of training, right? They go into the gym, they do something, and then they get out, right? They don't really think about this at all. But the one that is not, right, the one that spars with me intellectually, probably whether or not they work in some form of training or like lifting or exercise science field, even if they do not, right, I would say lifting consumes a large part of their life, right? Even though that's not their job. So that are those like I would say that if that general model do fit certain kind of people, right? People just have different temperaments and tendency based on what they do on a day-to-day basis. And I think that knowing what the lifter is like and tailoring the recommendation according to that individual lifter is actually important, because like I said before, it's about managing trade-off, right? So if I bombard you with a whole host of information, and at the end of the day, while you may know a whole host of information, but what is being left out is that, cool, now I have all this, right? And then you just leave out the practical element. So let's just assume that like I use a video recording software that's free, like Loom, that has only 5 minutes, and I spend 4 minutes and 58 seconds explaining to you the molecular pathway, right? But then because my time is limited, and I think we established that for everyone, we have a finite amount of time. I missed out the important element for this person. That I want you to split your proteins at least your 180 grams of protein evenly across 4 meals, and this is how I want you to do it, because I've spent 4 minutes and 58 seconds talking about mTOR, right? And that's kind of like the trade-off. And then to a person on the other end, they're like, what did I just listen to? I came out with nothing. But for the other person, on the other,
You could have just said that in the beginning.
yeah. For the other person, they'll be like, who wants that kind of like intellectual sparring, they will say, oh, you're just giving me like anecdotes, right? You're just saying that this works, right? Where's your scientific basis? Where are your citations, right? So it's very different. And then the outcome of it from that exact, let's just say the script is the same, but you flip the script, right? One's like super scientific for that person, and some super practical, right? They would just be, you're not meeting my expectations whatsoever. And I think that kind of like goes back down towards training. Maybe when you say that, okay, I put that close grip bench press, I create this narrative, you are giving something that meets their expectations, an answer that is plausible, right? And then perhaps then they are, like say, invested into the outcome. Whereas if you don't provide an answer that meets the expectation of the lifter, and you just say like, oh, cool, I have no idea why I do close grip bench press, just do it, perhaps things will be different, right? They were just like, oh, this doesn't really matter at all, right? I'll just go in, maybe I'll just like, my bench press max is 200 kilos, I'll bench like 60 kilos on close grip bench and then just leave, right? So what you say would probably influence behavior, and then I think that influencing of behavior would then lead to different outcomes for different people. And I think that's the same when you're you're catering the level of detail towards the person, and then being a good coach, you'll be able to figure out, or not figure out completely, but kind of understand what kind of message you have to deliver to the lifters that you coach.
Yeah. I thought of another example. There was a famous coach, this has been a few years ago now, famous coach who at a seminar was having, well, not just at a seminar, actual athletes that he was training, he was having them squat on BOSU balls, and so they're using like 40 kilos to squat, but they're standing on these BOSU balls to do it. And, the athletes thought it was stupid, And basically, every powerlifter kind of comes with this inbuilt idea that squatting, standing on a BOSU ball is stupid, and it probably is. But I knew the coach. I respect what he does, and I know a bit about his philosophy. So I don't know if I'm right, but I was at least able to come up with what seems to me to be a plausible explanation. At least it would work for me as an athlete for a little while. At least it would be enough to generate buy-in enough to try it. But he didn't provide that to his athletes, so instead they're walking around competition venue talking about how this is stupid, and they hate that they're being made to do something like that. I mean, at a seminar that I did going back a few years, there was a guy there who Bryce Lewis and I were doing a seminar in New York, and we have similar kind of approaches to training in terms of being collaborative with athletes and being athlete centered and things like that. So we're both kind of giving talks on various subjects, but that's a theme that underpins a lot of what we do. And this guy was an older gentleman, and he kind of was commenting on the difference in coaching philosophy versus like when he was a young man in school. Coaches were viewed as kind of like the general on the field. You did what they said, and they don't provide explanation, and you don't ask, you just do, right? And the communication is very one way. Versus now, it seems like it's not just powerlifting either. It's become a lot more universal. I'm sure that there's still holdouts in places where this is not true, but it seems to be a lot more universal, where explanation and being more collaborative is important. And it's an important part of how you develop athlete relationships and generate buy-in. And if you don't, then there are problems. In his case, at least, he mused that he thought that maybe one potential explanation for this would be kind of the expansion of the internet, since the 90s, but that's really kind of the time frame that we're talking about, is like the last several years. Think like Bobby Knight as a coaching example of the old paradigm, right? But he was just saying, like, given the availability of information, athletes will have questions. Why are we doing this instead of that? And so it just kind of lends itself to a more collaborative approach. That seemed plausible to me.
Yeah, that it's hard to like disagree with, like, the more information you have, when you have more choices, you would think that why are we doing this rather than not? Because like I said, it's kind of like factoring into a trade-off. There's no trade-off is that if there's only one choice, right? Like, for example, that you probably tell yourself that there's no trade-off to drinking some form of fluid to stay alive, right? Like, why do I have to drink some form of fluid to stay alive, right? Because that's probably the only choice you have. And I think that information, with information kind of like growing, then you kind of like go into like that, people say like, oh, the paradox of choice, where no choice is probably not great, right? Some choices are great, but we have too many options to pick from. It becomes like not great as well, because you just don't really know what to do, right? And I think that goes into, it plays a role into creating some form of adherence, right? Why would I want to stick to this program, right? Why would I want to do this exact same thing over and over again when I can try something else, right? And I think that I'm not sure, and I don't want to like strawman emerging strategies, but I would say that, quote unquote, if I were to put it really crudely, people would say a critique of like emerging strategies is that it gets really boring, because you're just repeating the same thing over and over again, right? So I think that communication and that buy-in element plays a bigger role. I spoke to a lifter, that I'm no longer coaching now, and we parted ways after I think like almost 2-3 years or even longer coaching. And essentially what he said was that I just need something new, right? I just need something new to kind of like reset my buy-in. Because I asked him this question. I said that, let's just say he mentioned going to a different coach, and then he just said that I'm being put on the wait list, and I want to let you know in advance that once that coach opens up, I'll just have to stop our coaching, and then but for now let's just continue. And I'm like, yeah, cool, I'm sure, like I respect that. I understand, we all go through different life phases. By asking this question, let's just say if that coach, right, and myself give you the exact same training program, right? Would it matter or not? Then they said it would matter, because then I still think that I would execute the program given by that other coach better, and then I would probably make better results. And I just need something new. And I said, yeah, if that is the case, sure, maybe like I said, maybe it's just things have gotten stale after a long time, and he just wants something new. And I think that people often look at it and from their perspective, I'm like, yeah, maybe it's a knock on my ability, but I see it as like, you just gone through the motions so much, right? That there's only so much you can do when it comes to online coaching. So perhaps there's something that's lacking that I'm not seeing, right? Something that I could have done better, but by the sheer fact that he said that, I just need something new to reset the scene, even though the program's exactly the same. I still think that I will make better gains on doing that exact same program from a different coach. So I probably phrased it in a different manner, saying that what if I wrote the program and send it to that coach that you are working with, and then he sent you the exact program, so you actually don't even know that I'm writing the program. So obviously that's just like I just post that thought experiment to him, and they just said that, yeah, I still think I'll make better gains. And then if that's the case, right, me being a coach who still want success for the lifter that I've built a relationship with, I'm saying like, this is kind of like, we part ways quite amicably, and then I just wish him all the best, right? So there are times like that where you just realize how important it is to find ways to not make something stale, right? Find ways to kind of like continue that buy-in, right? So it does really tell me that at the end of the day, when you look at what is your kind of like your time to peak or your exposure reduced to, that sort of like buy-in element or that subjective feeling towards the program actually plays a huge role. Because if we do say that if it is completely reducible towards the perceived experience of the lifter could be doing my program that I wrote and the coach, and you can think about the lifter basically getting zero exposure from everything that I do, because it's like almost like zero, like he's not perceiving that he's getting exposure at all, right? If it's completely reducible towards that subjective perception of experiencing the exposure, whereas that coach is probably getting, let's just say that 2 exposures a week, right? And then so at the end of the week you get 0 here, and then anything is better than 0, so it's like, yeah, you have like 8 exposures, and then maybe that's when you peak. So yeah, that's kind of like what I so a story that like immediately stood out to me when you were talking about creating the explanation, creating that buy-in.
Yeah. It's a tough situation to be in as a coach, but yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that the athlete perception has a lot to do with it, and it's kind of goes. It's almost what's the word I'm looking for? Cliche for coaches to say that it's more than just a program. But I mean, the story you told goes to the heart of that. I think that it is more than just a program. 2 programs just executed very differently from the same athlete, even. And it's not that they would, I'm sure he doesn't intend to go to the gym and sandbag programs, right? The sandbag workouts.
Yeah.
He intends to train hard, but it's small differences. For anyone who's ever competed before, you probably notice a difference in your own training when you actually sign up for a competition. I know I do. And I had kind of prided myself on like my ability to train hard, even outside of competing for a long time. I thought I was doing everything the same. My real motivation is the gain.
Yep.
Yet, even with that said, the act of signing up for a competition, having a date on the calendar, sharpens one's focus. It increases motivation. It increases the level of effort. And if a competition can do that, why couldn't something else do that as well? And you see coaches that emphasize this in different ways. Some coaches really put a lot of emphasis on that aspect, the I guess I would say the emotional energy that you bring to training. And I don't know, it's like anything else, there's good and bad to it. This goes back to your original statement, I think, of it being about choices, about trade-offs, and the opportunity cost. Like perhaps, really building in a lot of, internal pressure and emotional engagement that might be good for a lifter to make progress in the short term, but are they able to sustain that for the long term that we know that you need to really reach your strength potential. Does that become something that you need to manage as a coach to give people time to train with that kind of intensity of effort and then time away from it as well? I mean, I would expect that you do. And my approach to that has been to allow a lot of it to be self-managed by the athlete. I think that athletes are smart. Generally speaking, I think athletes are smart about athlete things, and that they learn from their experience, and they have key insight on their experience that a coach is not going to have. I mean, this kind of goes back to my disposition toward bottom-up approaches versus top-down approaches. I want the athlete to kind of monitor their own energy level and notice how much energy are they bringing to training, how much interest do they have in powerlifting right now. Bryce Krawczyk says to me sometimes that he's just orbiting a little bit further away from planet powerlifting from time to time. I think that's good for you in the long term. Sometimes you need to really get into it and be steeped in it and bring a lot more emotional energy to the training. But then sometimes you need to turn that down too. And I don't think the coach is in the best position to manage that always from a top-down vantage point.
Yeah, is this, like I said, you look at kind of like that individual response, right? Like certain times, like I think that there is also like, if you can kind of have a rough idea of when the time to peak is or how often is that exposure, right? There is a benefit as well to be like, okay, cool, I know your time to peak is X amount, right, of exposures, right? And maybe right now, at least if I know your temperament in your phase of life, I would just hold you short right before you peak, and then I would just call it off. I do think that people, that there is this, like lifting weights is kind of like, there's this like addictive component towards getting stronger and pushing yourself, right? So I think that sometimes there are people who, to their own detriment, need us as coaches to kind of like rein them back slightly. So I think like understanding that that lifter, like say, where's this person orbiting, at least in this time, closer to or further away from planet powerlifting, would actually make a huge difference. It's also interesting when you said that when you have a competition looming, you tend to train differently. I mean, like we all probably experience this in one point in time, where if you are lifting in the gym and you see an attractive person step in the gym, your estimated 100 max for that day suddenly spikes up, and then you'd be like, oh yeah, cool. One day, just because I saw this attractive person in the gym, and then my RPEs were lower, at the same weight, or I can do more weight at a similar RPE. So there's all the elements that actually factors into it. I think like studies actually even show like just the presence. There's a study that shows like just the presence of spotters itself improves like bench press performance, right? So actually not just doing anything, but just knowing someone is there, right? Giving you like quote unquote moral support, being there actually improves your performance. So that there's all those kind of like elements that are kind of like, I would say, it's not really like a training variable that you can control, right? I don't know whether there's studies of the kinds of spotters as well, right? Things like this, whether this person, you have a particular affinity towards this person or not, right? If you get someone that you really that you dislike to spot you, will that actually make you feel better? I have no idea, right? I'm just kind of like throwing out conjectures at this time point. And that kind of like brings me to think about like, with the rise of kind of like app-based training, or like AI coaching. I don't know, like, but this is an element where I think that AI would like lack, right? At least current models of AI, right? I think just in the general broader point of view, right? Obviously with like in the recent year, the past year, with the whole rise of like ChatGPT, I don't know whether you use it, but so in full honesty, like disclosure, like the first time I used ChatGPT was like 1.5 weeks ago, right? And my experience was underwhelming, so because I've heard a lot about ChatGPT. People say, oh, it's the next best thing since sliced bread. ChatGPT 4 is better than ChatGPT 3.5, which is better than ChatGPT 2. Perhaps I'm using it for the wrong reasons, right? Because I didn't ask ChatGPT to give me a line of code, but I just asked ChatGPT to write me like a letter, right? And then I'm like, when I read it, I'm like, this letter, especially with something that is kind of like related to powerlifting, this like chatbot, basically wrote it in such a general manner that if you could interchange like powerlifting with like baseball and the letter would still work. But then it left out all the nuance of what made this letter very like personable in terms of from a powerlifting coach point of view. So I'm like, yeah, this is like really underwhelming. But what ChatGPT did was it put in a lot of the words in place, like, like the typical like, oh, the, if, then, all that words, right? But it doesn't put out the content. So all of the trivial words, it's there. So it forms like a structure, and that was helpful for me. But perhaps my expectation was like high. That ChatGPT was just like, the first time I used it was like really underwhelming. For, like I say, for all those like AI techno optimists out there, if you're gonna hate me, like say, I fully admit it may be just a lack of, I'm not competent enough to use the ChatGPT well, so that might be a factor. But I'm just, full disclosure, it was my first experience with it was like kind of underwhelming. I'm not sure about yourself.
Yeah, well, my first experience also was fairly underwhelming. As I've gotten to know more about what it's good at and what it's bad at, I've been able to utilize it more effectively. And at this point, I think it's a pretty useful tool, as long as, I'm just aware of how to use it, like any other tool that you might use. And I think I'm by no means a Chat GPT power user or anything like that. I know that there's a lot more capability out there than I'm taking advantage. And I mean, I think that kind of connects with, when Chat GPT first started getting famous, people would send me these screenshots that they would type in, make me a training program, make me a powerlifting program in the style of Mike Tuchscherer, and it would do it, and it would do it. Like, you see the similarities, right? Like, it would spit out a program and you would look at it and go, yeah, I could see possibly having written something like that, However, that misses the point of what is being done. Like, it misses the point of the value of a coach to begin with. And to be fair, I don't think too many people really make the error. I don't think I've had anybody who said, I'm going to disenroll now because ChatGPT exists. The value of the coach is not in the thing that they write down. It's in the decision-making process that they use to get there. And currently, there are no AI models that have that decision-making process to the level that, I would want it to be at. Let me put it this way. I would not be relinquishing control of my own training or the training for anyone that I'm involved with over to an automated system at this time. I think there are ways to automate parts of writing programs to make it faster. So if you imagine like going back to writing like in the oldest school form possible, like just physically writing out a program on a piece of paper, you end up spending a lot of time on the act of physically writing. And that's not really the value of coaching either. The value of coaching, again, is in the decision making. It's in the assessment of information. It's in the interaction with the athlete. It's not in the writing. It's not the physical thing that you're writing down. So if you can have things that expedite that process, then great. And to that end, I mean, you could come up with ways to model any of the things that we've talked about so far in this conversation. Like if we talk about athlete buy-in or providing reasons why some decision gets made in a program. There are ways to do that with an AI system, and I think that like any like really good AI system would have to do that. But I haven't seen any doing that yet, just to be fair about it.
And I think as well, like people kind of like overstate the abilities. I mean, like I said, we are not like you and I, we're not like ChatGPT power users. If Pete Spence listened to this podcast, he'd probably say like you guys are like Neanderthals, because I'm pretty sure.
Sure.
Because I'm sure like Pete really knows how to exploit ChatGPT. So, or even like anybody who does some form of software engineering. But like, I think that even saying the word AI, right, has this like the word AI when it first was like written, there's 12 different definitions of what AI be, and I do think that, ChatGPT is close, but ChatGPT is still a large language learning model, right? So it just like gathers information from the internet right now. For example, it goes through like Wikipedia, all this free information, right? Google Books as a start, right? And it has all this information, and then the users, like the people at ChatGPT, for example, would put in certain restraints in to not spit out certain stuff, right? Like if you said that, you know, are Nazis are the Nazis good, right? They'll probably say no because they have like certain restraints you put in where say like you can't, like the chat GPT model cannot say this kind of words, you know. So like I said, these are just still like large learning language models, which is not really AI, you know. It's kind of like still in the machine learning world, right? Because like intelligence has like this really like specific word, you know, and depending on the definition people want to use. Personally, I don't think that we'll be there. I do think that this is kind of like, you know, the conversation of AI isn't really like a new conversation. You know, it's just that now it's just much more accessible. So people are like really getting like, you know, wow by this, right? Like you said, the internet only took off in the like the early 90s, right? The boom of the World Wide Web, right? We call it like, you know, back in the days we still have to type www dot the address and then .com. Now we can just like type something in. We don't even use www anymore. And if you ask somebody what that means, right? I know back in the day when I was learning about the internet, they said this is the World Wide Web, right? Because it's like worldwide, you know. But now when they talk about the internet, they automatically already assumes that it's global, you know. But back in the day, this was like something so groundbreaking that everybody in the world can communicate with one another to a certain extent, depending on your internet speed and whatever, right? But now with this boom, right, where everybody has like is accessible to everyone, people often give it like a lot of credit. And I think that the downside, at least from what I see, like if we're looking at trade-off, is that we think and there are certain like articles out there and people like have talked about it, that people actually say that ChatGPT isn't as smart as you think, right? And then like because there's flaws in the system. But people, when you think it's like the next best thing since sliced bread, or like this like super intelligent model, you automatically think that whatever this like chatbot says is true, you know. And then that kind of like takes away your ability to like think through the information, because you always think like this is always superior, this like robot or AI intellect is always superior to mine. So whatever I ask this person, when I ask this model this question, whatever this model spits out must be right, you know. And then you don't really like critically examine that set of information. And personally, like myself, because I don't know how big the conversation it would be, like AI coaching would be, right? Because you know, people back in the days, even with like certain AI models or AI coaching like services that that you know that are being provided, the question of, oh, do you think AI coaching would AI like coaches or coach based models using AI would actually replace like true online coaches, you know? And then like even back in the day, personally, I was like, no, I actually don't think so. But it could take over some tasks, right? But I don't think it will ever replace that coach, you know. So I don't know what are your general thoughts in regard to like that statement. Obviously, I have like reasonings why I don't think so, but you know, we can probably like chat about that after.
Sure. I think to start, AI in general seems to be, I don't know if misnomer is the right word, but it certainly does not seem to be clarifying to the conversation. It causes different people to think different things. And, you know, we end up spending large parts of any conversation kind of going around in circles on what it is that we're even talking about. But I think for the purposes of kind of clarifying this, let's not think about it in terms of a silicone-based, you know, human-like intelligence. Let's just think of it as, you know, various tools maybe that can generate new content out of you know, minimal prompts, or you know, maybe it's making observations or observing patterns that would otherwise be difficult or impossible to see. And maybe we can jump off from. I think it might. So I've had this conversation quite a bit with the other folks on the RTS staff. The thing that concerns me about app-based training is not so much that it would do as good of a job as a coach, because I think it wouldn't, at least in the near future. You know, far enough down the line, I mean, you can imagine anything. But for now, you know, we see things that are more subjective, that would be difficult or impossible to quantify, difficult or impossible to observe, difficult or impossible for a athlete to self-report on, that relies on relationship. And I think those are ultimately consequential things, you know. And if you were to ask me, you know, what is like to do the best job that I could possibly do for, let's say, one athlete to minimize any sort of like time constraint. I think having some sort of human interaction would be a necessity. Can you use automated systems to speed up the writing process so you can spend more time on decision making? Yeah, absolutely. I think any coach that's worth their salt is already doing. You can imagine an app-based system that expedites that process or does a better job than current app-based processes, or even an app-based system that analyzes data more thoroughly than pretty much any coach does now. It's possible to imagine these systems, and even kind of I've sketched out systems before on how you might do that. It's not easy to do, but it's possible to do. At that point, you get better app-based training than you do currently. It's still probably not as good as it is from a coach. The thing I think is worse, being concerned about from a coach's standpoint, is frankly the economics of it. It goes back to markets. If you had training, imagine a world where you have training that's very nearly as good as what a human coach can do, available for a tenth of the price. Yes, there are components missing. You don't have the human interaction. The training's not quite as good, and you don't have the relationship or leadership aspects of coaching intact with app-based training. But it's not even a question of whether it's 90% of the value that the coach provides to the athlete. It's whether the athlete thinks that that's worth the additional 90% of cost. And at least currently, I think that's a hard question for a lot of people. Are there some people that still will want the absolute best training that they can get? Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm one of them. But that won't be everybody, and that will be a pretty serious challenge to our industry, and something worth thinking about.
Yeah, like I think that looking at it from the perspective of, I wouldn't say like for a novice lifter, right? So for a novice lifter, they perceive value very differently, right? So a novice lifter may perceive the value being that they're being paid to work this like high level coach very differently, because they're paying a huge lump sum of money, all right? And it's likely that they will respond to whatever, right? I think that like say any coach worth their salt, if someone comes to me and said that I don't really have the budget, right, and this person's a novice, I say like, you're better off doing this, right? I don't like I from a perspective of like a nutrition perspective as well, just to kind of like paint it from a different perspective, is that if I have this lifter who's young, who just started lifting and wants to gain mass, and he's a student that doesn't have enough money, I said like, cool, if you still want to think that you're doing things in the right direction, we can schedule a call. We have consult, but most of the time, if you're just eating well, right, and you're eating enough, you put on weight, right? Especially if you just started lifting, and I'm not gonna charge you for that when you don't even have enough funds, right? And even like I said, if you want, I'm happy to just give you this advice, right, in an email. But if you still want to like pay for consult, right, this is the option. But I don't think that you need like a full-fledged coaching right now, So that's kind of like how I would respond. And then like to for this kind of lifters, perhaps working quote unquote with an AI coach, right? They will be able to reap the benefit out of it. But I do think that the higher level, we actually the higher level the lifter goes, that there's elements that wouldn't, like you said, the decision making process would not be able to, that the AI coach would not be able to make. And I think that from that perspective, I tell the coaches that works for Reformance, I said that whatever you think that, I said the way the coach you want to be is that even if you have a really robust AI coach out there, you still want to have an upper hand over that AI coach, and you have to build that quality that that AI coach cannot have. So you ensure that you are always staying in the market, right? So when I say that, what I'm saying is that, yeah, sure, you will have competitors out there, right? Maybe perhaps in the past it used to be other coaches, but now you have a digital competitor, would probably be something that can pick up rapid information really quickly, right? And probably with like no limitation to their energy and metabolite resources, right? Because they can just keep going on and on. They don't have to rest. So that is your competition now, and you have to upskill yourself to make sure that this thing doesn't put you out of a job. And you have to think about that thing. What is that thing? And that thing also usually boils down to a very individual, like what this athlete needs would be very different from, like I said, what goes back to the previous question that we were trying to address. It's like, this athlete needs something very different, right? So you have to cater towards that lifter, and that is that thing for that lifter. And I do think that what is exciting in our field is that you can look at it from perspective of like, yeah, cool, from a doomer perspective, that this like AI will completely like wipe out my job. I probably shouldn't. I shouldn't do this. I should just like succumb to the machines, and maybe I should be the one just writing AI programs. Or you can just say, I'm going to upskill myself. So instead of being a slave to Skynet, I'll be Arnold Schwarzenegger and go guns blazing. Hopefully I beat the AIs, right? And I think that is kind of like the interesting conversation to have, right? Whether we think that the AI is so smart that we just give up all hope, right, and let them do all the work, right? Or we just said, there's an element towards it. And my perspective is that I don't think that, at least personally, I don't think that AI will reach the level where it would actually sort of like replace our jobs, simply due to the fact that I think that from a coaching perspective, like I said, that social and human interaction is so strong, right, that's needed. And we have now it's like almost like beating a dead horse, because we talk about that buy-in that so frequently in all other podcasts, and even in this podcast, it's quite hard to not go back to buy-in. And I think that when we look at it from the perspective of like that human connection, I don't think that AI would ever be able to achieve that. So the initial sort of like why people will say like, oh, ChatGPT is this really amazing, is because like ChatGPT can write poetry, But I think that, let's just say if I ask ChatGPT to write me a book like Viktor Frankl, Man Search for Meaning, right? So Viktor Frankl is this psychologist, right, Holocaust survivor, and let's just say if I ask ChatGPT to write that exact same thing, and you can come up with the exact same style that Viktor Frankl will write in, but I know like clearly ChatGPT did not survive the Holocaust. I'll read that with so much like that book will be so much less impactful, because I know that ChatGPT didn't experience whatever that this person is experiencing. And I think that a coach is the same, right? A coach, we always say like, not every coach out there has to be as strong as Mike T, but I think a coach that lifts would be able to embody the experience of lifting, and then have that subjective feeling of what it feels like to lift. And the recommendations, knowing from a coach who lifts, would be very different if like this coach literally doesn't lift at all, because if the athlete has a conversation, it's like an athlete can literally tell the AI, bro, do you even lift, right? And then the AI would probably be like, no, I don't, right? And then that information will be very, very different. The perils or the hardship of like going through like 7-8 reps of squats, right? And that to an extent would actually say, this is a reason why I don't think that I should give my lifters 7 or 8 reps of squats all the time, every single time, because it really, really does suck. And obviously this is in a powerlifting context, because if you're a CrossFitter, 7 and 8 reps is nothing. Right? So I think that conscious experience, all right, at least, that AI would not have. So, there's this bet, right? I think there was this very, very interesting bet that actually, concluded very recently. So it's between like neuroscientist called Christoph Koch and a philosopher called like David Chalmers. So Christoph Koch and his partner like was Francis Crick. So Francis Crick was the guy that decoded the genetic code of the DNA, right? Watson and Crick. So Francis Crick is one of the Watson and Crick. So, and the Christoph Koch and Francis Crick think that they would be able to decode human consciousness and kind of like boil it down to neurons. And this bet like happened 25 years ago. And David Chalmers is a philosopher. And then in that conference, he basically coined the term like hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem is basically how can things which are like material embody some form of like feeling of what is it like to be, that subconscious feeling, right? And David Chalmers basically said they had a bet, and they said like by this year, right, which is 2023, neuroscientists or like scientists will figure out what consciousness is. So David Chalmers said no, it won't. And up to 2023, right, David Chalmers won the bet, right? So Christoph Koch gave him a bottle of like expensive wine or whatever, and then he doubled down, and he said that he posited another year and said that we'll figure it out in this year. And then David Chalmers like said he'll accept the bet. And then Christoph coach said, I think I'll lose the bet, but we'll see where it goes, right? So I think that there is something to be said. And like this whole like debate about like consciousness, and in philosophy it is like categorized under like the philosophy of mind. What is a mind, right? People can have all that debates, but I think that there is something to be said about the feeling of lifting, right? You have that subjective experience of like the feeling of lifting, or that's basically what people call like philosophy, they call it like qualia, right? It's like the feeling of being something, and I think that like AI would not get that feeling, and then that prescriptions would be very, very different in that sense.
Yeah. Well, to kind of add an example to that, at some point, if you're going to push your training hard or anything, you're going to have to take some risk and do some things that are uncomfortable. We know this. And like for me, yesterday, I was in a training session. I'm supposed to do squats. And for whatever reason, I was incredibly nervous. I would even say afraid that I was going to injure myself. And it was not specific. It wasn't like I had an ache or a niggle that was acting up. It was not tied to anything, really. It was just a fear that kind of came out of nowhere. And it was, I don't know, not like crazy intense, but it was notable, and I was kind of thinking to myself whether or not it was a good idea to, add weight for the next set or not. Like if I was strictly looking at, the normal data stream that I would normally look at, I should add weight. It was kind of within the expectation, but then it just kind of had this subconscious fear. And I ended up choosing to go ahead and add the weight, and I went through, everything was fine. I did that because I knew what has gone into the planning of this training, and I was able to, kind of reassure myself that this was the right decision, in that moment. If this isn't even limited to AI, but we'll come back to AI in a second. If it were a less robust process that came to the result of this training program, I'm not sure that I would have had the same level of buy-in. I'm not sure that I would have had the same willingness to take the risk, and that is going to happen at some certain points, right? The further you go in any pursuit, the more the small detailed decisions matter, getting the broad strokes right is good enough in the beginning, but as you go, you need to make finer and finer detailed decisions to continue seeing meaningful progress, I think. And this is one of those, like knowing when to push it, when it's worth the risk, and when you should back off is hard. And you have to be able to put your confidence in something. For me, I think kind of putting my confidence in the process that I use to come up with the program helps me to trust that program. And I know because I've bailed on so many programs over the course of my career in instances that are not as severe as this one, but over time I've built more and more robust systems that I can put more trust in. Each one I build tends to be a little bit better. So I was able to kind of lean in. If it was, like I said, if it was a different coach, maybe that's not there. Definitely if it was an app-based system, that level of trust would not be there. To give maybe a slightly different example, there are these translated Russian texts that were kind of dogmatically passed along in the late 90s, early 2000s powerlifting culture. It was just kind of one of these things that, if you were serious about this, you were supposed to buy the translated materials at some point. And like, it's all badly translated and it's impossible to read. And it's all about Russian weightlifting anyway. It's a different culture. It's a different sport. So how much is there to gain from any of the questionable? But in a few of these, there would be example programs in the back of the book. And I can't remember which text it is that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, but there are some powerlifting programs, or there are also some American football programs that are in there. And I would look at those and they would be impossibly difficult programs. Like when I would look at them, there's no way that I could do that, or that any person that exists that I know of could complete these programs, much less do it in the context of, playing another sport. So like if you were to just give me that program, there's no way I would have any buy-in for that. There's no way I would trust that system. And like, to get back to the AI system, I think that's why, for one, it's important that we know what is going into the decision making to begin with. There's different ways of doing machine learning. There's different ways of doing artificial intelligence systems. Some of them have a black box problem. Some of them don't. And I think that's one reason why it's really important that whatever system you use for app-based training, you be able to trace it, and say, hey, I'm, 2 weeks out from my competition, and this is prescribing me, I don't know, power cleans, or something weird. And you go, why is it doing that? You should be able to figure out why and figure out whether that's a good enough reason for you or not. And just kind of knowing what I know about app-based systems at this point, like, I have been building systems, and if you talk to some of my clients, they'll happily tell you that I've used, it's not really even an app, it's a highly abused spreadsheet to help in the decision-making process. I mean, it's still heavily written by me. And honestly, it takes me longer to write these programs than any program that I've written so far, but it's very robust to changes in athlete status, to changes in, maybe the recovery is better than expected or worse than expected, or maybe they overshot or undershot or did an extra set or changed the exercise, or any number of different things. Programs should adapt to these types of things, especially in a situation like we're talking about, where the decisions start to matter more and more. So I've got this system that it really is just augmenting my decision making. It's not making decisions for us, and that's a thing that I continue to harp on for everyone, is like, don't let this thing tell you to do something stupid. We still have to stay engaged. We still have to keep our wits about us when it comes to making training decisions. So I would just apply that to pretty much any kind of training, automatic training, app-based training, AI system, whatever. I would apply that same logic to it. Like, I want to know where it comes from. I want to know, like, even if you're not a coach, you're not an expert, you're not going to evaluate the nuts and bolts and decide whether that's something you believe in. I want to know, what is it considering? What is it not considering? And do I feel like that's sufficient? And that's going to help inform my decision on whether or not I can trust it. It's going to tell me to do something, and I'm going to have questions. And I have to decide at that point, do I just go through and listen to what this thing is telling me, or do I modify it? Do I go off plan? And both of those are potentially good decisions if you have the background data that you need to make it. So anyway, I'm kind of monologuing there, but that's kind of my thought around app-based systems. I'm curious what you think.
I think a large part of it, is like, when you look at the factor in the decision, and you mentioned the background knowledge, right? One thing that, even though, let's just say we have this fully functional, like, every decision is like super robust from AI, I think that AI model would not be able to have is empathy, right? So I think when it comes to coaching, empathy plays a huge role. And the reason why I say AI models cannot have empathy is that I think that, empathy would probably somewhat loosely define as the ability to, sort of like be a part of someone's suffering and hardship. And if you think about it from the perspective, is that what kind of suffering would AI go through? Like, oh, cool, I'm infected by this virus from this competing AI company. I'm like, I think using an example, like, for example, like this, is just that you can tell someone, like, I can say, I know what it feels like going through injuries. I know what it feels like for my body to hurt while you peak, and then you communicate that particular set of message. And then this is why I'm making certain concessions for you while you're training. And an AI coach will not be able to tell you that, like, because an AI coach, for what, we don't see, first of all, robots, like, from even like robots lifting weights for now, and what suffering would they go through? Like, what kind of suffering would like a silicon chip based, let's just say, model go through, And at the end of the day, when you read it from that perspective, it's just like, this is just a whole bunch of pre-programmed nonsense. Like, why do I, like, it's like basically talking to almost like a customer service online, where you're like, oh, I have a lot of issues. I'm talking to this, like, customer service chat online. I'm like, yeah, you just give me a whole bunch of pre-programmed response. This is not what I'm looking for, And I think that factors into the background knowledge as well, right? I think that for coaches, all right, better or worse, we have our perception of like what really is tough, what is tough, and then the thing as well is that the more we speak to a lifter, right, not only do we learn what is tough for the lifter or hard for the lifter, but we know what that feeling of it being hard is like, right? We can kind of like empathize, man, like maybe it takes 10 sets of 8 to make this lifter feel like he's suffering, maybe it takes 5 sets of 4 for me to feel like it's suffering. But what links us together is that we know, quote unquote, suffering in training would be like, and then we have that feeling of like, man, after a set of like BFR squats, my leg feels like it's just gonna like, every muscle feels like it's just gonna burst. I'm like that AI coach would not be able to tell you that.
Yeah, I don't know that I found that I am sometimes a worse coach when I lean into that. That I need to be able to write the program that the athlete needs and not read myself into it. That I write programs sometimes thinking like this would be impossible for me to do, but based on what I know about that athlete, I know that that's not exactly what you're saying. So I'm not trying to straw man your point either, but I can imagine a system. Let's take the example of like poor recovery during peaking. I can imagine a system that accounts for that in some way. That takes note of reduced recovery and makes appropriate updates to the program. It doesn't support the lifter emotionally, and I don't think it can, even in the the example of like being like some sort of chat bot that does offer conversational type of support, right? Like it's not the same because like you said, it's coming from a robot. So there's like that kind of human connection or lack of human connection that can be a problem. But from like a nuts and bolts of training standpoint, I can imagine a system that would be responsive in those ways. And that I think that would be important. That would be like one of those things that I would want to know about. Like, does the system do that? Or is it limited in that way? Because I'm going to find myself in the situation where, I'm 3 weeks out and due to additional stress and due to XYZ, maybe a weight cut or whatever, I'm not recovering as well, and the program needs an adjustment. Can the app-based system account for that, or is it limited and it can't account for that, and I'll have to do that manually? One way or another, that's something that will be important.
Yeah, and I think that I would probably largely gravitate towards the position that you probably have to add some manual input at the end, right? So like that's because like I said that at the end of the day, I think when it comes to making decisions, right, the most robust set of information and knowledge we can have. And while an app-based system may be able to do it, right, and provide more robust nuts and bolts, right, I think that the core component of that sort of like that emotional connection, right, is where that app-based system would lack. And then is when our role as coaches would come in to add that in, which means that the AI will always lack something that we can provide, right? So there may be tasks that the AI will be able to do better than us, but there will always be something that we can always do better, and that is that emotional connection from that perspective. Like, I don't know, like most probably, like, like I don't know how these models function in terms of like describing like, oh, my muscle really hurts right now, like does it is it able to distinct between, oh, my muscle really hurts, and I feel absolutely trash during a peak, right, versus, oh, I feel really trash during like a volume block, right, like 16 weeks away, right? Like, is that feeling exactly the same, right? But for a lifter, that the peaking feels, right, is actually very, very different from the feels from like 16 weeks on like a quote unquote like volume block in general. So I think that at the end of the day, we use like AI models to help us, like, I would say, make it more efficient, right? To help us in the decision making process. But ultimately, we still would have to make at the end of the day, and that would probably require some form of manual input from our end, just because I think that there is a lack, right, that this AI system would always have. And at least from a perspective, from a coach's perspective, and this is like for all the coaches out there to kind of like take hope in that they won't lose their job, is provided that they always we capitalize on the fact that, this, and we know that there are limits to what an AI model can do. So we don't have that, that doom, that vision of doom that this, AI would replace us when it comes to the coaching. And that kind of like boils back down towards the whole like, coaching is more economics rather than physics. Because if it's everything is like everything is physics and everything is like 100, like very certainty and high value of prediction, right? With certainty, the AI model will be able to like do our jobs way better than us, right? Because if I put input A, it comes out with input B, right? And then the AI model will be just like, yeah, this is the best input you can do for your situation, right? However, like I said, if we go back down and we do agree, right? Obviously, if people do not agree with the premise that, and people think coaching is more physics than economics, then obviously this doesn't stand, right? But if we do agree with the premise that coaching is more economics, then I do think that we as coaches would kind of like still have an upper hand, and that doom and gloom vision where people have that we will completely run out of jobs, at least from an online coaching perspective, I don't think that would happen, at least in the near, I would probably say like near or long future when it comes to online coaching. I do think that my people talk about like existential, this is slightly like a off tangent, is like my idea. People say like, there's the existential risk where, the AI would like, have on humanity, right? And like I think the risk is like 1 in 6 in the next couple of like, I don't know how many decades, right? Just to sort of like have a comparison, like a nuclear war wiping out humanity is like 1 in like 1,000 or something like that, right? So the existential risk posed by artificial intelligence is actually higher, according to some like researchers that look into this field. By my thought on existential risk when it comes to AI is probably that humans just really believe that this AI is just so intelligent that we give everything to we unintentionally become slaves to the AI because we think that they are just like the smartest thing in the world. Like we almost create like God from our own creation, and then we just like, everything the AI says is right and the AI can't be wrong. And I think that would probably make the population as a whole slightly dumber over time, and then we just become we devolve, right? And we are then sort of like lesser creatures to than AI. And if you think about technology from a perspective of how technology now is actually like sort of like severing called like strong emotional bonds because of social media and all that, right? I wouldn't say it's impossible where it comes to a point where humans like emotional connection is just so poor, right? That the thing that we have over AI, which is our strong emotional connection, has just dwindled to an extent that now we no longer have the intelligence because we think the AI is all that, right? So we're just like dumber as a whole. And due to the progress of technology, and that also like erodes our emotional strength, and then we then become really, really inferior to the artificial intelligence model because now we don't even have emotions anymore just because of technological advances, So that is kind of like slightly off tangent, but I think that is kind of like random stuff I think about sometimes.
Well, I do think that we probably we can imagine different scenarios where that becomes either more or less of an issue. I mean, I can imagine scenarios where and I'm not the only one that's doing this. Like I can, I'm getting this from somewhere where you imagine AIs that do pass a Turing test and that are able to show empathy, or at least what appears to be empathy for all intents and purposes, and is kind of like better than your best friend. Like it's possible to imagine these sorts of things. So where does that lead? I don't know. And you probably want to listen to people who think about that stuff more seriously than I do. But kind of where you were going with potential effects on coaching, whether we're talking about like far off, general or not, the possibility exists for really good app-based training to exist and for that to be potentially disruptive to our industry. And it doesn't have to be like, like a robot level artificial intelligence, right? Like we just, even the system of basically designing really good spreadsheets can conceivably deliver training that's much better than what some people are able to deliver now. So I said before, like it does, if you imagine the potential future where there's really good app-based training for a tenth of the price, is 90% of your value, does the customer perceive 90% of your value come from that human connection or not? That's not the only potential outcome. If you're a coach, then paying attention to investing in this type of space, not being caught flat-footed, investing in your own system becomes an important part of long-term strategy, I think. It will allow you to adopt and leverage things like that so that you can maximize the areas where you do still continually provide value. So I don't think it has to be an either or. There are happier, scenarios to come out of that. I definitely think it's worth paying attention to and putting effort into. But we should not imagine the future of coaching to look exactly the same as the past of coaching.
I think that kind of like, just to sort of distill it, right? We look at AI as a tool that makes
Yeah.
makes us as coaches more robust, rather than we completely outsource all our responsibilities to the AI, right? Like, I think that that's really, really important. I think there's this whole conversation about like, say, you have the existential risk people, like the AI doomers, right? And then you have like the techno optimists, and I think that out there, I think that it can be managed, right? We don't have to embrace either one or the other. If we think that they said that what we use AI for is for human flourishing, so we still keep human flourishing as the core, right? And not just, why are we making AI for the sake of making AI, right? Like, if we still keep human flourishing as a core, like, if there's a time when we probably have to halt development of AI because we think that it's going up, and we have to do that because we are not making AI for the sake of AI. We are still keeping the core as using AI for human flourishing. And I think that if we translate that in a coach's perspective, it's more of like, we use AI, whatever tools that comes out from the market, right, to inform our decisions, to make us better coaches, remembering that being a better coach is still the main goal, But if we just think we're going to outsource like everything to the AI, and at the end of the day, I think, that whole doom and gloom stuff could potentially just be like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you just outsource everything and then you put yourself out of a job, right? It's kind of like this self-fulfilling prophecy that we probably can avoid. I think that is kind of like framing the usefulness of a tool. And I think that is kind of like training as well, right? We select tools that we think are useful, and we look at the large in our toolkit. Perhaps AI is just a tool that is probably the modern invention of a pocket knife, right? Like a tool that can accomplish multiple tasks, but in the end, we are still the one wielding that tool, right? And I think that from that perspective, coaching will evolve, and hopefully, like you said, for the better. But I do think that it's important to have that approach, right? I think for yourself as well, who has been largely involved in all this system building, right? Like I said, you you are like the godfather of like RP for powerlifting training, right? And then now you kind of like evolve your systems, right? And all of this, at the end of the day, your systems are getting more robust, and people would say like, why are you like keeping, at the end of you can literally like keep all the knowledge to yourself, but by making your system more robust and more accessible, technically you're trying to like put yourself out of a job. But what you're doing is that you're actually using all those tools to make you a better coach. And then when you're a better coach, people seek you for that reasons rather than actually just buying a tool, right? So I think that is kind of like what we're getting at in this very large conversation that touch upon many different topics.
Well, I mean, it's difficult, right? And like in any of the systems that I've built, it's like I told the story earlier about my training session yesterday, where I kind of have this mostly out of nowhere fear of injury that just kind of popped up. That's a thing, and you can imagine that's. I think for most people, something like that pops up when there is something going on. They feel a twinge from an old injury that's, and they wonder if that's an early sign. Maybe they should cut the session short, live to fight another day, kind of thing. The situation like that, you're talking about such a narrow gradient of experience that it's hard to communicate that at all. Because if it's too minor, then you probably say, it'll be fine. push ahead, and it's just these things happen. But if it crosses some threshold, then it's enough of a signal that it's worth paying attention to. And figuring out where to draw that line is incredibly hard. It's hard to communicate where on that spectrum you are to begin with, and then figuring out where to draw the line is really difficult. To do that in an automated system is, well, it's really difficult. So it does pretty much always come back to making a recommendation to the lifter. And I would say that that's kind of where my systems are at currently. It's about making a recommendation. I tell this to my lifters too, is making a recommendation. And it's based off of all of these things and from there, we have to decide whether that's a recommendation worth following or not. That, if it's on the line, I rated my soreness a 3, but it could have been a 4. Well, if it's a 4, the recommendation is reduce training load by however much. But if it's a 3, then the recommendation is to continue as normal. So which one do you do? It's like these threshold scenarios, and it can be difficult to manage, but there's a way through it, and it's kind of maybe not fair of me to describe it in this sort of way because it sounds more vague and more difficult to navigate than it really is, because these things are gradients as well. If you don't know, you can split the difference and you can adjust future training. Like there's ways to find your way through this, but we have to know that, and we have to kind of know what our systems are accounting for and how we intend to adjust to emerging information. If we've thought through that stuff, then great, then we can take those recommendations for what they are. We can make good decisions and adjust to make even better decisions tomorrow. If we don't know what those are, then we're, probably not in a worse spot than we would be otherwise, but certainly not as good as you could be. And, if there's one thing I've learned from building these types of systems, it's just how much decision making goes into actual real human coaching. The amount of decisions that goes into even just writing one program is vast, and it's really difficult, incredibly difficult to try to replicate that in any sort of automated process.
I think that like I said, I think coaches provide that very narrow breadth of experience that's really important. Kind of reminds me of the story of Stanislav Petrov, the guy who prevent like the all-out, the nuclear retaliation, when he basically disobeyed Russian orders and essentially didn't say that, the Americans are firing missiles at us, right? So, and he basically like saw the fault in the system and then decide, in his better nature, going against Russian orders, because according to the media, we know what punishment can be like in Russia, and now he is credited as the guy as like, oh cool, he saved the world by going through going against the orders and from the system, and then obviously at the end found out there's a fault in the system. So I think that's kind of like really like, obviously trading is not like preventing a nuclear war, but I think that,
I think the point stands that like decisions matter, and decisions in the face of sparse or hard to read information, the decision still matters. It doesn't matter that it's a difficult decision, but the effects are real.
Yeah, 100%. I think at the end of the day, that really is kind of like the crux of the conversation, right? You trust the coaches to make good decisions, and lifters trust the coaches because they have that, goes back to that buy-in, right? And that whole decision making process is constantly juggle and balance that by evaluating the trade-offs, the patterns that emerge over time, right? And perhaps like an AI system would help us be able to detect those patterns, because after all, like large language learning models are to an extent, seeking some form of pattern, right? And then we can kind of like cross-reference that pattern with the pattern we kind of have in our mind, and at the end of the day, with that, it allows us to potentially, right, make better decisions, because I think that there is still the temptation to be lazy, and if we are catering to like a large number of population, just like, okay, cool, everything this AI tells me is right, I'm just going to say yes, right, approve, rather than sifting through 50 different, like, you mentioned that when you write this program with those systems, it takes you a longer period of time. But if you want to cater to a larger population and theoretically the AI should make you more efficient. Like, why would I put myself through more trouble? It's just like I approve every single decision, and then out of that, something catastrophic could potentially be a result just because there's like oversight, But then again, it kind of like goes back against the point where you use the tool to make yourself a better coach, right? And a good coach would want to sit down and sift through whatever information that comes through, whether that information comes from the lifter telling you a certain set of information, or that information comes from an AI going through certain processes and spitting out that pattern to you. So I think that our jobs are still, as coaches, is to make decisions based on multiple sources of information and then try to like think through them.
Yeah, I think the reason why it takes me more time to write programs in the system, I think it's because the decisions it puts in front of me are decisions that I perceive to be more consequential. Whereas in old system, there's an obscurity to the kind of information that's presented. If you imagine writing a program on a piece of paper and you have an athlete who maybe you perceive that they need more training load to progress. So you say, well, how do I get them this additional training load? Well, I'll add a set here, I'll add a set there, and that's pretty much where it ends. But why 2 sets? Like, why not 3? Why not 5? Why would you add to those exercises and not other exercises? Why would you add on main lifts but not accessory lifts? Those are all decisions that you make as a coach. And at one level, maybe you're just making those heuristically and, you're moving quickly and these are like subconscious processes that you have going on. Or maybe you're not really making the decision at all. You're just doing the same thing that you've always done. This is how I do it. And so part of what my system does is puts those types of decisions in front of me. And then I have to choose this example of like, where are we adding volume, or, a common thing for, more novice lifters to fret over is like, why are we doing 5 reps, not 4 reps or 6 reps? Well, I do think there's an answer to that. And there are consequences to choosing even 1 rep difference over the course of a full training block or even multiple training blocks. I think those are detailed decisions, but, at some level, those are consequential decisions as well. So it's not just to pick one and move on. I want to think through that process, so I'm spending more time on the program, but it's more time on the program making decisions that I view as being important. Maybe one final example of how that's happening. I have a mechanism built into this on how I can override certain workouts in certain conditions. If the training has skewed too light or too heavy, I can switch from one type of session to a different type of session. Like, I've had lifters who, for example, are prone to pec strains, and maybe these pec strains, we can see them in advance a little bit by taking note of trends in soreness and stiffness, not necessarily immediately before the session, but they're more subtle signals than that. And if we're just kind of paying attention as part of our data stream, we can possibly see that. So kind of deciding what threshold to choose there, how much soreness or stiffness is acceptable, and then where do we draw the line and say, okay, now at this point, we need to start making modifications. So like, I view all that stuff as being more consequential. And it's not even that I made those decisions heuristically before, I just didn't make them, and I think that's true for a lot of coaches, is that we just write the thing and we move on. We make a lot of these decisions heuristically, based on what we've always done, or maybe just kind of a gut feeling. And I wanted to, add more to it than that.
Yeah. I mean, I completely like see your perspective. I think that it's interesting because you use like tools like this and system to kind of like create innovation, right? So you spend more time because you want to try create something new, right? And I think that innovation would probably take effort. By definition, innovation is trying to create something new. Unless you're stumbling upon it by accident, right? You are going to have to put in more effort to try and push for an innovation to happen. And by that definition itself, you're trying to do something better and make yourself as a better coach. But on the flip side, if you're just outsourcing everything to make your effort less all the time, right, then you won't create any the innovation would be unlikely to happen. So I think that
Yeah.
that is kind of like the perspective is that
Yeah.
like if you want omelets, you have to crack your eggs, right? So that is kind of like you got to put in the hard work if you want to innovate something with the tools that you have. And if you just essentially leave everything to the current tools, right? And the systems were kind of like created by you, right? And if you just keep recommending whatever the system recommends, you would just be stagnate. Things will just be stagnant with that current system. But you are looking for ways to always
Sure.
innovate. And like I said, I've seen that in your career from an outside perspective, in the initial like large part, right? Until recently, now we have more personal conversations. But like I said, you like I
Yeah.
always bring up this story back in the days when I first read the RTS manual, and then all the way to emerging strategies. And then I remember you had like project momentum as well, right? So like you have this like that progression, and yeah, I think that those are actually like great sort of like perspectives to hold on using certain tools for certain purposes, and then continue to try, I would say, push the boundaries of training, right?
Man, I'm gonna be mindful of your time, and I'm gonna have to go round up my definitely biological children. So
Yeah.
no AIs running around my house in the evening time for sure. But yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, man.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure to speak with you on training related topics, and this one's no different. And I look forward to having you on the podcast again.
Likewise, the pleasure is always mine. Like I said, I just appreciate someone being able to talk about things that are, largely esoteric in nature. And hopefully the listeners that made it all the way to this end gain a thing or two and frame things, hopefully able to help them see
Sure.
something in potentially a different light. So yeah, thank you for having me on, and I look forward to the next time.
Of course. And thanks everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you all next time.
Right. See you.